Hello everyone, this is André Gagné. Welcome to my YouTube channel. So this week I'm going to continue the series I started a while back on the Coalition on Revival. And you can see on your screen I've just provided the link to their website. As you know, on their website there is a collection of 17 documents called worldview documents. And we've been looking at several of them in the past couple of weeks. So today I'd like to focus on one document in particular, the one that is called the Christian Worldview on the Family. This is very relevant because we've seen in the news in the past couple of days issues around gender equality, issues around the family, abortion, gender identity theory, things like that. And we sometimes wonder why people from the Christian right adopt certain perspectives. Now, the Coalition on Revival, when they wrote this document, they wrote this a couple of years ago, like 10 to 15 to even 20 years ago. But it's still very much reflected in a lot of evangelical churches or Christian right groups. So despite the fact that, we have been exposed to more, these types of churches that are hip and they kind of try to be relevant and close to the general public. These types of churches that we often associate with the seeker-sensitive movement, the church for the unchurched. When you start exploring a little more what they are and what they believe, because at first you have the impression that a lot of these churches are very welcoming to anybody. And in a sense they are, but after a certain time, if you really want to be part of that community or particular community, you quickly understand and you discover that a lot of the values that they share are quite traditional. And in fact, a lot of the values that they share are similar to what we will be looking at in this document. Now, there's a lot of stuff in this specific document on the family. It's one of those documents that contains more information. I'm not going to be able to cover everything, but there are a couple of things that I think are worth noting, because they can be problematic for many individuals, especially today, in today's world, and how we conceptualize and understand the family and relationships between the genders and the rapport that parents can have with their children and things like that. So it causes some problems for many individuals when we encounter these types of values. So what I'd like to do is kind of look at what they are and zero in on specific elements that are, I think, of importance and that people in general should be aware. And that will help you maybe understand where a lot of people from from various types of Christian right groups, be they Catholic or other evangelical subcultures, kind of have a better sense of where they're coming from and understand why they engage in what they consider to be a true culture war, where they feel they have a sense that their Christian values and their Christian identity is under attack, and they need to defend and fight for those values and this specific identity. Now, let's look at one kind of proposition here. Again, the document is divided in affirmations and denials. So at the beginning of the document, you have point 2 that you can see on your screen right now, and we can just read this. It kind of serves as a basis of what the family is. So it says, we affirm that the biblical definition of family is the nuclear family of a heterosexual married couple with its natural and adopted children, together with family branches consisting of all nuclear families descended from common ancestors. And here there's a note about how the Bible uses the term clan, tribe, and nation for these larger groups. see the varying usages of the Hebrew word mishpacha. So it's the word that's translated for tribe. Now, the denial is, we deny that the Bible countenances any other definition of the family, such as the sharing of a household by homosexual partners, and that society's laws should be modified in any way to broaden the definition of family or marriage beyond the biblically understood definition of heterosexual marriage, blood relations, and adoption. So as you can see in this short statement, they basically, the Coalition on Revival essentially defines what marriage is. It is a heterosexual marriage, and it is in the confines of a man and a woman with their children, be they born from them or adopted. And marriage should not be redefined in any other way. So it's their biblical concept. Again, they take passages from the Hebrew Bible, but it's not always clear what even these passages in the Hebrew Bible talk about. There's no institution of marriage per se in the book of Genesis. It just talks about the creation of humankind. Now, when you look at that, and when you have groups today, modern groups, because I gave an interview recently on evangelicalism and the political impact of evangelicals in America, in Brazil, but now also more and more in Canada, and we're seeing this through various means. For example, the political victory of Doug Ford is essentially to be credited to some Christian right groups, because they felt that Doug Ford would take them seriously. They felt that he would push up to a certain extent their agenda, and we should keep an eye on what's going to be happening in Alberta with the leader of the Conservatives there, Jason Kenney, and how many different Christian right groups, be they Catholic or evangelicals, from some evangelical subcultures, are aligning themselves to most likely support this candidate. So a lot of these issues revolve around the question of the family. What is the family? How it should be defined. And I talked in my interview also. I had the privilege of commenting on what's happening in Quebec with some of these evangelical churches that try to be very much relevant. There's one church in particular in Montreal, but not only in Montreal, there's one on the South Shore of Montreal, several churches that kind of adopt this seeker-sensitive mode. And they, of course, present themselves, like I said, as very open, very tolerating, and they want anybody, and they at least they say that they are open to all individuals. And in one case, I was noting that on the website of one of those churches, it talked about the issue of valuing the family, and how it's important that the family should be valued. And this is where you have to ask questions. What is the family? You see, a lot of journalists don't go further. They need to ask specific questions. How do you define the family? And you'd probably be surprised that the family is not this, what we understand to be families today, all the different possibilities of what constitutes a family, including homosexual couples and LGBTQ. Of course, that's not their perspective. This is not what constitutes the family. For them, what constitutes the family is essentially what we read. It's biblically defined. Now, of course, they're allowed to embrace this view, but the problem is they give the impression that they are open. So they should just simply state what they are, instead of pretending to be very open and open-minded and accepting everybody. Because in the end, this is not the case. It's really not the case. And it is, of course, in 2018, very problematic as a society in and of itself, to have people even discriminate against various conceptions of the family. It is a problem because, again, it's basing a lot of the arguments that these individuals have on an ancient text called the Bible that has a completely different anthropology than what we understand humankind to be today. It doesn't take into consideration what we know about biology and how we understand and conceptualize ideas of gender, and how gender is a social construct. So that doesn't take that into account, the Bible, because the Bible has a different worldview. Now, let's continue reading some of these propositions. You have another one. In fact, I want to read two now. You see them on your screen. It's the definition of the role of the man, his headship. So you have points 7 and 8 that are quite something when you think about it. And you might be surprised. Some of you might be surprised with what is mentioned here. Point 7 says, we affirm that in God's order of Christian family government, Christ is the head of the man, and the man is the head of the woman, as Christ is the head of the church, having given himself in love for her redemption. That the husband must look constantly to Christ for direction, and that the husband's headship requires commitment to his wife, unselfish sacrifice to her, a spirit of a servant, reinforcement of her unique qualities, and active love and nourishment, cherishing and providing for her. And there you have a bunch of verses across the spectrum of the New Testament. Now, for the denial. We deny that the husband ought to exert his authority over his wife by words or actions that demean her dignity as a person of equal value and worth before God. And that a man can serve his family better by attending to his own needs first than by putting his family's needs first. So here it's clear, he should put his needs, the needs of his family at first. Point 8, we affirm that the husband has final say in any family dispute insofar as he does not violate biblical principles, that a husband's headship is irrevocable, and that if the husband is incapacitated, the wife may exercise his authority as his deputy, not as his replacement. Ephesians chapter 5 and chapter 6. And now for the denial aspect in that point, we deny that a husband must earn the right of headship, and that he may be disposed by his wife, and that he may deny his headship, in order to evade the responsibilities that attend it. So this is the biblical order. So Christ is above man, and man is above his wife, and the children, of course, are under that. So because the biblical worldview is that of a man and a woman, this what is according to their understanding of what constitutes the family. It is a man and a woman. The man is responsible. The man is in charge of the family, and women should be submissive, should come under the leadership of men. Now, of course, you have in the language that is expressed, and thank goodness, in a sense, males should not act in any way that will demean his wife. There seems to be this notion of equality but subordination. It's kind of sometimes a bit difficult that how that can be articulated, but in their understanding is that as Christ is in charge of the church, and there's a parallel. It's interesting. You can read Ephesians chapter 5 and part of chapter 6. As Christ is in charge of the church, or is the head of the church, man is head of the wife. So there is a correspondence in parallelism between Christ and man with the church that takes a kind of a feminine role, and women. And this is the patriarchal structure of what is suggested in one of the letters that is addressed to Paul, a Deutero-Pauline letter, that of Ephesians. Now let's continue. Now you have a better sense of this idea of the family and its subordination. Women should be subordinate to men. Let's continue reading a couple of other interesting points. You have the other one on your screen. It's there. It talks about the women now and her responsibility, her submission. That's point 13. We affirm that God calls the wife to submit willingly in loving obedience and respect to her husband, as the church submit herself to Christ. You see, this is what I was saying. And that wives with non-Christian husbands are called by God to be a testimony to their husbands by their gentle, submissive obedience, and not to weary them with constant criticism. Now the denial. We deny that the wife should undermine the headship of the husband. That submission requires a wife to relinquish her own moral responsibility to perform any sinful act or to refrain from practices commanded by God in obedience to her husband's unbiblical demands. That submission prohibits a wife from respectfully and lovingly rebuking her Christian husband as a sister in the Lord. That it is wise for a wife to continue to rebuke her husband after he has clearly heard her once, and that the Bible's teaching regarding a woman's submission applies to any relations other than to her husband and to teaching men in the church. Now, here it's the role of women, and of course it explains what I was explaining, what I was saying previously on the comparison between the church and women. Again, it's how women should behave. They should submit. This doesn't mean that women are to engage in practices that are unbiblical, especially if they are married to non-Christians, non-Christian males, that would ask them to engage in sinful behavior according to their understanding of what constitutes sinful behavior, of course. Women are not in obligation to do that. And women should also take their responsibility if they are married to Christian men, and if Christian men deviate from God's will, to rebuke them, to kind of correct them as a sister would correct a brother in the Lord. So that's recommended. But again, not over exaggerating this perspective, because of how the Bible conceives authority, how it explains authority should work in the relationship between a man and a woman. Women should stay married. We'll see it later, but women are not to divorce necessarily men that are not Christian, but they should, of course, be a testimony to them, that their behavior would reflect what true Christianity is for them, so that they might eventually convince their husbands to become Christians. So again, the goal is to kind of influence their spouse to embrace their perspective on the Christian message. Now let's continue. There's a couple of other interesting points. You see them on your screen. We saw here the woman's submission. Now let's look at how discipline should be administered. In points 17, and I've joined together point 45, which deal with the same elements. So we affirm that God commands all children to honor their parents and minor children to obey them in the Lord, that Scripture gives parents the right and responsibility to enforce obedience through discipline, including corporal punishment. So there's a series of texts, most of them from the Hebrew Bible, or what is called the Old Testament. And that training in godly obedience is the foundation of personal self-government and of all civil governments of free men and women. We deny that the family should be a democracy, that lovingly enforced obedience harms a child, and that civil government has a right to define wisely administered corporal punishment as child abuse, or to allow children to divorce their parents. Now, point 45, we affirm that biblical spanking, may cause temporary and superficial bruises or welts that do not constitute child abuse, but that proven brutality to a child resulting in permanent disfigurement or serious injury should be punished by law. And again, you have Hebrew Bible passages about this. We deny that the right and responsibility to discipline ever give parents the right to seriously injure their children. And we can say, thank goodness. Essentially here, the responsibility of children is to respect their parents, to be submitted to them. The state has no business in the ways a family is run, how discipline is administered. Of course, if there's abuse, and there seems to be language recognizing that, but abuse seems to be defined as disfigurement or permanent injury. So you're allowed, biblically speaking, to spank your children. And they use passages, and there are passages in the Hebrew Bible that do talk about that. And for them, it's a legitimate way to correct their children. And the state, in that sense, has no business in defining what corporal punishment is, defining or kind of imposing their definition of what constitutes child abuse, and children even divorcing their parents. So there's very little rights for children here. Because in the biblical mandate, and again, we have to recognize that this is a patriarchal worldview. This is a structure, a family structure that was that of people that lived in a particular region of the world, for many of them like 2,000 years ago. So society has changed over the years. We understand the development of children differently. We can measure things much differently today, and we understand the rapport that people should have with individuals, and how some rapport with children and how we treat our children can have profound psychological effect on them if we're not careful on how we discipline them, or how we kind of show them some of the values that we want them to acquire. So I think we need to be very much aware of how these groups conceptualize the family and how they understand discipline. Okay, and in some cases, discipline, corporal discipline, is justified. So don't be surprised if sometimes you come across individuals that have been in themselves part of a Christian family and left and felt that they had been experiencing some forms of abuse. Don't be surprised, because up to a certain extent, depending on the worldview that this specific Christian family had or has in relation to the disciplining of children, various outcomes can occur. Now let's continue. You see on your screen another series of interesting points that are worth discussing. It's about the marriage, the choices, and the commitments. So point 21 is very clear. We affirm that the man who desires to marry should consult wise counsel, including that of his family, and choose his wife under God's guidance for her godly character and suitability as a partner in his calling. A lot of emphasis on, of course, Proverbs 31 here. We deny that Christians should marry non-Christians, and that sexual attractiveness or other carnal considerations should dictate a Christian's choice of a mate. So here, marriage, people that engage in marriage, if they are Christian, they need to be wise in the way they choose their spouse. That's good for women, but that's good for men. And of course, there's the standard, this famous standard of Proverbs 31, that becomes very difficult for a lot of women to bear, because all the responsibilities that are mentioned about what is the righteous woman or the wise woman in Proverbs 21. I remember at the time a lot of women on Mother's Day heard a sermon related to Proverbs 21, and they were pretty discouraged, some of them, because they felt inadequate compared to what was said by the pastor in the pulpit according to the standard, the model of Proverbs 21. It's unfortunate when you think about it. It puts a lot of pressure, and women feel inadequate in their relation to their husbands and their roles as mates in the family, as wives, as part of this Christian home. Now, it's also very much against their principles to marry non-Christians, be they a woman who is not a Christian, or a man. So if someone is a Christian, he should or she should not marry. If the person becomes a Christian during their marriage, or they've been, two people were married for many years, and then one becomes a Christian, they should not divorce. It's not the cause necessarily for a divorce. But if they haven't been married, they should not marry people that are non-Christians. Okay, and that sexual attractiveness should not be the standard by which someone should choose a mate. Let's continue. Very interesting stuff, but it gives you a sense of what constitutes the family. There's three sections here that follow one another that I think are worth reading. So you see it on your screen, these sections that talk about issues around abortion, infanticide, euthanasia, and discrimination in medical treatment. So point 35, we affirm that all human life is holy and intrinsic, God-given value, beyond human ability to measure, because it bears God's image regardless of race, age, gender, prenatal status, or physical or mental handicap. And then you have a bunch of passages to kind of support this. We deny that the value of human life is to be measured by its quality, that abortion on demand, infanticide, euthanasia, or discrimination in medical treatment against the handicapped, the very young, or the very aged is ever right, and that any race or gender has greater intrinsic value than any other. Point 36, we affirm that every human being begins life from the moment of conception, that the zygote, embryo, and fetus should therefore be entitled to full protection of law. Then you have a bunch of texts that talk about this. That killing the zygote, embryo, or fetus through abortion or any other form of violence is murder. That removal of the zygote, embryo, or fetus from the womb is justified only when leaving the child inside the mother would cause death for both mother and child, and that the church should encourage research to improve the chances of survival for a baby so removed, and that no baby should be deprived of nourishment or necessary medical care after birth for any reason. We deny that either the mother, the father, the civil government, or any other person or institution has a moral right to decree the death by abortion of any child for any reason, be it social, economic, psychological, etc. Point 37, we affirm that elderly men and women have value in God's eyes and have the same God-given right to life as other people, and that euthanasia, taking the life of a person through either positive action or neglect, is therefore murder. We deny that human life is to be valued by its utility in society, and that elderly people, even those most severely incapacitated, are valueless, and that elderly people should be used for medical experiments without their consent. So what you see here is their stance on abortion, their stance on euthanasia, and it's very clear. For them, there's no such permission to abort a child. The conception is, or the existence of the human being as at the moment of conception. There are biblical passages that kind of vaguely talk about that. But there's no straight biblical passages that deal with abortion. You have to bring in murder, the issue of murder, to legitimize this idea that they are anti-abortion. It's not clearly defined as we understand abortion today. But if they start with the idea that human life begins at the moment of conception, and that human life is terminated, that constitutes in and of itself a murder. Euthanasia is not permitted also. So you understand their worries, and this is part of their culture war. You see, when we talk about what they understand to be Christian values, this is one of those cardinal elements. You see, when the Christian right mobilizes itself politically, it mobilizes itself around common causes. Those causes are, for example, the issue of abortion, the issue of same-sex marriage, issues around religious freedom, and freedom of conscience. These are things that mobilize them. They don't have always, in some cases, clear biblical passages to support that, but they go from deduction. They deduce the fact that if human life, like I said, starts at the moment of conception and is removed or is terminated, that's in and of itself murder. Now, all of this, this document ends with a call to action, and I just want to read one point from that call of action, which really summarizes the spirit of this document, that they're really engaged in a cultural war, and they are ready, and they should be ready. Those people that call themselves Christian should be ready to pay the price necessary to win this war. Look at point 11 on your screen from that last section at the end of the document. This section is called a call to action. So congregations, pastors should be helping each local church to establish by itself or in cooperation with other local congregations its own crisis pregnancy center and anti-abortion program. This is no less an obligation for Christians in America today than was Christian opposition to the Holocaust under Hitler in Germany, even at the risk of imprisonment and death. So you see, the comparison is very, very strong. You've heard this probably, many times, that abortion is like the Holocaust, or it's comparing, the death of millions of aborted fetuses to the death of millions of Jews in the Holocaust. This is what they think. But here, it goes as far as saying that issues around abortion, issues critical to life, issues around the family, because again, abortion is an attack on the family, issues around even same-sex marriage, these what they would consider as being secular values, they have to be opposed. And if it means to imprisonment and even martyrdom, so be it. Christians in America have to deal with that. And I have to say that, of course, Christians in America have taken this position, but not only in America, in Brazil, we've seen it with the last elections, with Bolsonaro's victory. 70% of evangelicals from the 56 million evangelicals in this country voted for Bolsonaro. And this is coming to my own country also, in Canada. We're having a more and more this mobilization of Christian right groups that will be fighting for what they consider their cultural survival. They see themselves strongly engaged in this cultural war, and they will do anything in their power, anything possible to influence the political agenda of governments, so that governments and the rule of law take them extremely seriously. So this was what I wanted to share with you this week on the Coalition on Revival, its worldview document on the family. So if you do enjoy my videos, please don't hesitate. You can definitely subscribe to this channel. It's completely free. You can also share all these clips that I do pretty much every week. You can share, you can like, and you can comment. And I will talk to you again very soon, and we will be discussing once more the impact of religion in our modern world. So have a great week, and talk to you again very soon.